Let's talk about behaviors that end connection in your marriage. In this video, I'm not going to be talking about what your husband is doing wrong. If you're feeling disconnected or lonely in your own home and wondering why the man who used to look at you like you hung the moon and stars barely looks up from his phone or the TV, this is a video that'll help you to see what you can do about that. Today, I'm going to be sharing about behaviors that I had to personally stop doing that really transformed my marriage from cold silence and resentment to genuine connection, even before my husband made a simple change. The first connection killer we need to talk about is emotional reactivity. Responding to small triggers with big emotions that create a wall between you and your husband is really hurting your connection. When your nervous system is constantly on high alert from juggling kids, you've got work, household management, and a marriage that feels increasingly disconnected, your brain becomes primed to interpret neutral or even positive reactions as threats. Let's say your husband leaves socks on the floor, or he forgets to text that he's going to be late, or he makes a comment about dinner, and suddenly you're just flooded with emotional response that feels completely justified, but in the moment, it's actually massively out of proportion. I used to think that my husband was intentionally trying to push my buttons with these little things that he would do. And I have this client that I was working with, we'll call her Beth. And last month, Beth, her husband had mentioned in passing that the kids seem to be watching a lot more TV lately. And she immediately launched into this 20-minute defensive on her parenting skills. She was completely in tears and bringing up the time like 3 years ago that he missed their son's soccer game. After things cooled down just a little bit, her husband explained that what he had meant was that maybe they could plan more outdoor activities on the weekend. But her emotional reactivity took a potential moment of connection, like planning something fun together, and turned it into 3 hours of tension. Here's the hard truth that a lot of people don't want to hear. No one can make you feel emotionally safe in your marriage until you learn to regulate your own emotions. The good news is that you can start with something small today. Like when you feel a familiar surge of big emotions coming, you can pause, take a deep breath or three before you respond. And just that tiny gap between stimulus and response gives the rational part of your brain a chance to come back online. And it's not about suppressing that emotion. You're not trying to hold it down because you don't like feeling that way or you think it's crazy. Really, you're just trying to create a real safe space to understand that you're feeling the way you do, but that you can choose the way that you want to be, the way that you want to respond rather than being hijacked by that emotion and letting it ruin an evening or a weekend. The second behavior that kills connection is mind reading, which is assuming that you know exactly what your husband is thinking without asking him directly. We all do this to some extent, but when disconnection has been building up in your marriage, mind reading becomes more automatic. You see your husband sigh when he walks in the door, and you're convinced that he's just disappointed at how messy the house is. Or maybe he's quiet during dinner, and you're like, I'm just sure that he's just ungrateful for everything that I've done. There's not even a thank you or anything. Maybe he's looking at his phone, and you just know he's thinking about how boring your life is together or that he doesn't want to have conversation with you. But here's what's really happening. Your brain is creating narratives to explain his behavior, but these narratives are coming from your own fears and insecurities. They're not necessarily reality. I've spent months convinced that my husband was deliberately avoiding housework because he thought it was my job or because he was just being lazy. Every time I saw him relaxing while laundry piled up or dishes just sat in the sink, I silently seethed. When I finally got brave enough to have an honest conversation with him about it in a very non accusatory way, I discovered something really surprising. He genuinely didn't notice the things that I thought were obvious priorities. And he completely has different priorities that I have. And he just needed me to communicate clearly what needed to be done and which tasks were important to me, where I felt like I had his help. I had been building up a resentment based on a story that existed only in my head about his motivations, when in reality, we simply had different perspectives and communication styles. So the solution isn't to stop having thoughts about what your husband might be thinking. I think that's pretty impossible. The solution is to hold these thoughts lightly and verify them with direct communication. So the next time that you catch yourself mind reading, try to say, I notice you're quiet tonight at dinner, and I'm telling myself the story that you're upset with me. Is that accurate? This approach does two powerful things. It validates your perception while acknowledging it may not be true, and it creates an opening for genuine understanding. So, the third connection destroying behavior is keeping score, mentally tracking all the ways your husband falls short while minimizing your own contributions to the disconnect really hurts any future connection. There's nothing that kills intimacy faster than the invisible scorecard that is hanging over your marriage. Maybe he forgot the anniversary, so you forget something in retaliation. He didn't notice your new haircut, so you don't acknowledge him in some kind of way. He spends Sunday watching football, so you spend the same amount of time scrolling Instagram or Facebook the whole time, seething with sighs and different emotions that are very noticeable. Really, this game of emotional tit for tat creates a marriage where both people feel constantly shortchanged. I used to have this running list in my head of all the ways my husband wasn't meeting my needs, and I could recite every time he'd chosen sleep over intimacy, work over family, hobbies over helping with our son. What I conveniently ignored was how often I was emotionally absent, even when physically present. How many times I'd rejected his attempts for connection because I was too busy obsessing over previous failures. And the truth is, I was so busy tracking his deficits that I couldn't see my own. Breaking free from scorekeeping means choosing to focus on what you can bring to the relationship rather than what you can extract from it. And this doesn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior or having no standards. It simply means that you're recognizing that connection flourishes in an atmosphere of generosity and not accounting. Try this for 1 week. Consciously drop the scorecard by responding to your husband based on the present moment, not the past experiences or grievances. But when he asks about how your day was, answer genuinely instead of thinking, oh, now he cares. When he does something helpful around the house or with your children, thank him without adding a finally or for once. The fourth connection killer is avoiding vulnerability. The fourth connection killer is avoiding vulnerability. Building up protective walls to guard your heart that really ends up imprisoning it instead. When marriage feels unsafe emotionally, the natural response is self protection. You really stop sharing your dreams with each other because maybe he didn't seem interested last time. You don't tell him when you're struggling because he might use it against you in the next argument. You don't initiate sex because maybe you've been rejected, or maybe it's because he doesn't initiate first. What started as a reasonable defense mechanism eventually becomes the very thing that prevents reconnection in your marriage. 2 years into our marriage struggles, I realized I had constructed some pretty thick walls around my heart that even my husband, when he did try to connect, and he did in his own way, I just couldn't feel it anymore. I'd become so committed to protecting myself from hurt that I made myself really unreachable. And one night he asked why I seemed so distant, and I gave my standard response, I'm fine. But something in me cracked open, and I admitted that I was just feeling very lonely in our marriage and very unhappy. And that moment of vulnerability, as terrifying as it was, created the first real conversation we had had in so long. Vulnerability isn't about oversharing or emotional vomiting. It's selective, intentional openness with appropriate boundaries and without blaming. And you can start with really small disclosures and neutral moments, like maybe you share a concern about one of your children. You can share about a challenge that you're facing at work, or even something simple as, I've missed talking to you in this way. When you take small, brave steps towards vulnerability, you're creating these little openings for connection to flow again. The fifth, and perhaps the most insidious connection destroying behavior, is living in wait mode, which is putting your happiness on hold until your husband changes. This might be the hardest truth to hear, but it's the most liberating once you accept it. If you're waiting for your husband to change to make you happy, you're giving away your power. I've spent years thinking I'll be happy when he finally understands me. I'll feel connected when he finally learns to communicate better. I'll enjoy our relationship when he starts putting me first. Meanwhile, I was missing my actual life, waiting for a future that might not ever arrive on my terms. The problem with wait mode is that it creates a catch-22. You're withholding your best self until you feel appreciated, but you won't genuinely feel appreciated until you bring your best self. Your husband senses that withdrawal, even if he can't articulate it, which makes him less likely to move towards you, which confirms your belief that he just doesn't care, which makes you withdraw further. And it's this spiral of disconnection. Breaking free from wait mode means reclaiming that responsibility for your own emotional well being and happiness. And this doesn't mean that you're accepting a loveless marriage. It means that you're recognizing that you can choose joy, purpose, and fulfillment right now, regardless of what your husband does or doesn't do. When I finally started investing in my own happiness, pursuing interests that I had abandoned, when I was nurturing friendships, prioritizing my physical health and mental health, something unexpected happened. I became more attractive to my husband and really to myself. I liked being around me. It wasn't just a physical attraction, but it was like energetically. He was drawn to my renewed vitality in a way that he hadn't been in my resentful waiting period. So start by asking yourself, what would I do differently today if I wasn't waiting for my husband to change? Would you take a class? Would you call a friend? Would you get out of your pajamas? Would you start that project? Then go do that thing, but not as a manipulation to get his attention, but as a gift to yourself. Because your happiness is really important, and to outsource that to someone else, even the person you married, is impossible. Creating connection in your marriage isn't about having the perfect husband who always says and does the right things. It's about becoming a person who can regulate their own emotions, that can communicate directly, that can let go of scorecards, risk vulnerability, and claim your own joy right in this moment. So start with one of these shifts, and you really might be amazed at how quickly the temperature of your marriage changes when you stop participating in the behaviors that really freeze your connection. Remember that you have far more power and influence in your marriage and can create the relationship that you want, starting right where you're at with the husband that you have. If this video resonated with you today, check out my other YouTube on how to stop taking things personally in marriage, where I share more strategies about emotional regulation in your closest relationships. I've also linked it below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss next week's video.